AI is remarkably easy to use, but remarkably hard to use well.
That's Schuyler, Chief Strategy Officer at Kingo AI, and someone who spent time in Boston parks trying to communicate with Geese to understand why AI keeps misreading you. Stay with this one, because by the end, you know exactly why your AI keeps giving you generic outputs and the one shift that changes everything about how you prompt it. So you explore how humans, AI systems, and maybe even other species misunderstand each other. What first drew you to that space?
It's been a thread that's followed me throughout my career, but if I were to point to a really concrete moment, it would be when ChatGPT first came out, and I realized that as somebody on the autism spectrum, this could be a new tool for me to help me understand social situations. Wasn't something that could necessarily give me all the answers, and I still don't think it can or should. It definitely helped me start asking questions about, hey, here's something that happened. Here's an unexpected output or reaction from this. What factors could I be missing? What's going on? And so I started to think about it helping me make it so that I'm not misunderstood when I have one intention and something else is understood. I was working with the Boston Geese, looking at how I communicate, if they could recognize that communication, trying to honk like them. I'm trying to elicit a reaction, realizing there's a lot of overlap between what I was doing with the geese, what I was doing with AI, and how AI's interpreting our inputs. It's trying to understand from an incomplete context window, trying what we want without a complete understanding of our context.
You're completely right about the context part, because incomplete prompts always give very incomplete responses. So our prompts have to be as comprehensive as we can.
You're not talking to another human. You're talking to a system. Assumption differences or context differences in culture can change depending on each model, and spending the time up front to understand what assumptions is this model making, what types of context does it have outside of the context I'm providing, but how do I need to communicate so that it understands what I want? Rather than just saying, yeah, make me this thing, and then being upset when it doesn't make the thing the way you want.
So just putting in that context and making sure it understands what you want. So how do you explain what's actually happening when an AI misinterprets a founder's prompt?
Most of the time, there's not enough information. AI makes assumptions. It's based on training data. And so in its training data, if this input elicits this response, it's looking for hallmarks of that and trying to recreate it in the response it creates. So if you give a very generic input, you're going to get a very generic output, because it's essentially trying to create an answer that it's trying to give you what it thinks you want. And when it doesn't know what you want, it will give you a very generic output. Misinterprets things even when you've given a lot of context. Usually it's that you've given too much and it can't actually process everything at once. We've been looking at Kingo and in the AI industry at context engineering and figuring out the best ways to provide context, how you need to do that, and how to structure things. It can also be that terms that you're using can have a variety of different meanings and that you haven't defined those, and that to you, this term means one thing, but to the AI, it means a different thing. So I think when there's misinterpretation happening, one of the first things that I'll do is try to set up a workflow or a process. We've been playing with MCP tools and MCP servers, which are basically, if the API is giving an AI access to like all of the data in California, an MCP tool or MCP server saying, yes, go to California, but here's the directions to exactly where I want to go. You take a left at this light, you go down this road. Setting up those tools and taking the time to set up those processes can make it much more helpful.
So your art practice uses embodied experiments like mimicking Geese to study communication breakdowns. What did that teach you about how AI interprets us?
So first of all, I was embodying geese, trying to walk like them, trying to honk like them. And that means that it was a very foreign process to me. Most people spend a lot of time trying to honk like geese or walk like geese. And I had not spent that much time before doing that either. What it taught me was that I need to effectively communicate, especially with the geese. I needed to do a lot more observation and listening to understand their context. And in the literature that they would call this an umwelt, the ways in which a species moves through the world and their experiences. So if all of the information in the world is like a house, the umwelt is essentially where you are in the house and what windows you can see through and your view of the garden. from that. And understanding that what I'm doing and to effectively elicit a response, I need to listen and observe first. Working with AI tools, usually if I'm playing with a new tool, before using it for a workflow at work or in my creative practice or in marketing, I'll try to spend the time up front to understand how it works and do a similar process of listening and observation and trying to break the model to understand how it's working. So asking it for absurd things that it doesn't have only one data point in the real world. An absurd example with ChatGPT, I was asking AI about the ethics of transforming myself into a goose, or would the government make me pay taxes if I were a human consciousness in a goose's body? They're really silly prompts, but because ChatGPT didn't have data to draw from in the real world, I got to see its assumptions. I got to see the question it was asking, the way in which it was moving through that problem. And then I could say, okay, that's how it moves through a process it doesn't understand. Now I can apply that to something where I want a specific output.
Definitely. So you would recommend before jumping into a new AI tool to just play around with it first and just see what breaks, what doesn't.
Yeah. I think the thing that will get you to proficiency the fastest is play and experimentation and looking at what a tool gives you versus what you asked for and what consistently it doesn't give you or has trouble giving you, and then use that to dictate your workflow. So you're not saying, oh, this is exactly what AI is going to do in my workflow. It's looking at the tool and its capabilities and then tuning the workflow to that.
So you often talk about the gap between intention and perception. How does that show up in the way that founders write prompts?
There's a gap in assumption in terms of definitions. For one person, a creative brief might entail like XYZ or might entail these specific components. For another person, it might be something very different. If your intentions are not very clearly articulated, they won't be perceived or understood in the way that you want. Making sure that those intentions are articulated and that you've really thought through your own process. Because I think a lot of times when intention and perception have a disconnect, it's because somebody probably hasn't spent as much time thinking about how it's something moves from their brain to the real world, assuming that others have the same exact context you.
So just having a pause before you prompt and thinking through whether your intentions will be perceived correctly.
But then there's also iterating based on data. When a founder's looking at a prompt or outputs from AI, what am I asking for versus what am I getting? And if I'm not getting what I want, then I probably need to change something instead of keep giving it the same thing. It's not just a matter of giving more context, it's giving context that will actually shift the output and looking at variations in what you're giving and what's produced.
Definitely. So going back and forth and just making sure that you're getting what you want from the prompts.
And documenting that so you can come back to it at a later point.
I think documenting your prompts is a huge game changer.
Elaborate for yourself.
So if a founder keeps getting outputs that don't match their intentions, what's the simplest way you can help them clean up the structure and clarity of the prompt?
The simplest way would to use more of a formula. There are some structures out there, but the one we use at Kingo is usually start with the role of the AI tool, what you want it to do and how you want it to move through this prompt, thinking about the task itself. What do you want it to do? Giving it the output, saying how do you want that task to be delivered, giving additional context at the bottom, all the other information that you would need to be able to complete this. I've also found a simple way to get you closer to what you want is to define up front what would make a good response versus a bad response. Prompters are you assessing? So if it's a campaign strategy, what are you looking for? What makes a good strategy versus a bad strategy? I found adding a couple things at the end, justify your responses or saying something about your role is to be this person who's been doubted in the past, but you always do well. Giving it a little bit more of a scenario does tend to, and I think there have been papers published that giving it a scenario makes it so it uses different pathways than it normally does.
Making sure that you're giving it a scenario and just seeing what you get from it, essentially. So your background blends behavioral science, design, and marketing. How does that interdisciplinarity lens shape the way you teach people to work with AI?
Especially thinking about the behavioral science and psychology piece, I tend to think a lot about decision making, both in terms of how people make decisions, but then also how AI makes decisions. Coming from a design background, I've definitely seen the limitations of AI.
Yeah.
It's definitely gotten a lot better. But there are still distinct limitations. And I usually, if somebody's intending to just use AI right now, they just want to start using it, start playing with it, I usually suggest that they think about what they're really good at and think about what they want to outsource. So think about, in my case, if I have an art background, I have a design background, I have a marketing background, I would probably want to outsource the pieces that are not that, or pieces where I'm asking AI for something and then I know I can bring my expertise into it. Regardless of somebody's background, it's really thinking at the beginning, what pieces of this can I automate? What should I automate? And what will really get me the end goal that I want? Because sometimes we shouldn't automate everything. And sometimes, depending on the client, automation can actually be a bad thing because they're expecting something that's much higher caliber or something that just AI can't do right now. I've encouraged people to reassess where AI is at and not just write it off if it's not good at something right now, especially as somebody with a background in design. It's not great at design, but it's definitely gotten a lot better. And I can still take components and pieces of that, starting from where you're at, what you're really good at, thinking about how do I move through a process? What pieces do I assemble? Can I get to those pieces any quicker? And what's the end product? Who's the end consumer, end client? What are they expecting? Especially for startup founders, sometimes the clients you're working with, they just want information, something more concrete. They don't need high polish. They just want something delivered. In that case, you can automate pieces of it and bring in your expertise where it makes sense. Other clients, though, they really want your expertise and knowing when to outsource versus not, I think, and when expertise and taste matters versus when it doesn't is going to be a really big change in the industry.
Definitely. I think it's a very important question to ask yourself what to automate and what to not, because sometimes you could over automate the creativity that you can bring as a human and as an expert in a subject matter. It could be a waste to not put that in.
Setting up spaces where you really let yourself have that and don't just take the AI's output and run with it. Knowing what you're an expert in, knowing what you're not an expert in, and knowing where to push back on AI. If you've seen something or you have that expertise to say, no, in this industry, that doesn't work as well. This is going to work better.
Definitely. So you've built translation systems for startups and institutions. What does a translation system look like in the context of AI?
I think it's documentation, experimentation. It's looking at changing slight variables in what you're doing and how that changes responses, whether that's prompt engineering, whether that's introducing new tools like MCP tools or MCP servers, or introducing other connectors, or what a workflow looks like. So I start building something to try and understand how something's working. I'll start with experimentation. I'll start with broad strokes of things. Oh, what happens when I change this large variable? What happens to different subjects, or what happens when I ask it for something very different? Going into each of those and seeing, where do I have expertise? Where would I know distinct differences, or where would I recognize something that's not quite right or really nuanced? I think it's understanding your own expertise, documentation, and experimentation, both on a larger scale and as a smaller one.
So for founders who feel unsure about their prompts, what's one perspective shift that makes working with AI feel clearer?
Thinking about it like an intern. And I've heard this from a couple of people, and I love that framing. So thinking about it like having unlimited interns. Can do a lot. They are exceptionally productive. Think about it as a lot of interns on Red Bull, but they can make mistakes. You have to know that. You have to provide them the context to actually do what you want them to do. Thinking about AI as somebody new to your company who's never worked with any of your processes before. How would you explain this to an intern? People have different areas of expertise, and that's okay. Well, if you're asking for something really complex, you can't assume that the system has all of the context it needs. You need to feed it that context and be clear. Thinking about working with an intern, not only the context, but also how do you want this? How could somebody misinterpret it? Before you're expecting something that's exactly what you want, think about how could this be misinterpreted? If I were somebody who's never worked in this industry, what would I need to know? And you can get around some of this by not just doing it in one prompt. I've seen people have more success if they break things up into multiple prompts so that you're asking AI to start out and say, become an expert in XYZ, understand the factors that go into creating a strategy, understand this industry, and moving through a process where you're leading somebody through. So if it were an intern, thinking about what would you give them as the first day of work? Having that be the first prompt. What would you give them as the second or third day of work? Having those be separate prompts instead of combining a month's worth of work or a week's worth of work into just one thing and saying, do it and do it well. Finding resources, finding people online that are doing demos, creating templates, creating frameworks that you can start from instead of trying to start from everything from scratch, and setting aside time to experiment. One of the biggest things we've seen that's been helpful for people is setting aside that time that's dedicated to experimentation, to play, to trying to understand how these systems work. Because otherwise you're getting frustrated because you know you're supposed to be using these tools. You don't know how you're supposed to be using them and why aren't they working. It can be hard in a company too to drive adoption when founders don't see the value. Setting aside the time, creating the proper context and understanding. Also finding community if you can. Something we found success with at Kingo is after our AI boot camps, we've had peer groups for people. People have a much easier time working through problems, finding value in these tools when they have other people to bounce ideas off of. And it's not you alone in your computer getting frustrated. Find a community in either other people who are working with these tools or through online creators.
Definitely. I agree with the intern scenario. I think taking your time and slowly introducing what you want and the context is better than giving one large prompt. So if a founder has zero technical background, what's the first simple AI workflow you'd help them set up?
It wouldn't be a copy and paste thing for each person because it can vary so much by industry. But I would say thinking about one simple workflow that you do every day, something that routine, something that you spend more time than you'd like to doing. Administrative stuff can be simple to start using AI for. So whether it's responding to emails, that's usually a baseline that can be the default there, or doing research in an area they don't have as much understanding in. When people have very little technical background, using AI to start helping them ask better questions instead of start just immediately giving outputs delivers more value up front. Asking it, hey, I'm working through this scenario. What kinds of questions should I be asking? Or act as a skeptic or act as a critical advisor. That can be a really simple place to start. I've also found that working with people and finding small use cases where it's very low stakes is usually the best way to do it because people want to use AI immediately for everything, but that's not necessarily doable or productive. Something that we've been saying internally at Kingo is AI is remarkably easy to use, but remarkably hard to use well. I think that's the key takeaway.
Getting started with something simple, repetitive work for you that you do every day. It's one of the best ways to get started. And once you get into it, then you'll go on to more advanced stuff.
With those repetitive things, you understand them inside and out. You're not trying to ask AI to do something you don't fully know the process of or can fully understand. If it's something simpler, it's much easier to understand in more detail.
So you often explore communication when perfect understanding is impossible. How should a founder think about AI under this reality?
Whether it's a person trying to communicate to another person or a person trying to communicate to a member of a different species or a person trying to communicate to AI, we're all coming at things with different contexts. And in that sense, perfect communication, like perfect in the sense of every single nuanced detail of what you're trying to communicate, whether in body language, whether in the words you're using, the tone, is pretty hard to achieve, if not impossible. With AI, it's really about understanding what you communicate outside of just the text itself. If you're in a meeting and you delegate something to somebody, what are you communicating when you give somebody a task that's not just the words, not just like what's written in the brief? What do they know about you and your style that makes it so they can actually do that? What makes a really good coworker? You. And what makes it so that you can usually work with people well? Because I think, especially thinking about clients I've worked with in marketing, people think that they're a lot clearer than they are. People think they communicate more than they do. Thinking about working with somebody on logo design, people will say, I want something minimalist and I want something that has a futurist element. But those words mean very different things to them than they do to me. Being very specific, but also providing examples. What I do with a client, I ask them for examples of what is minimalist to you, what is futurist to you. Using that same approach with AI, giving it examples of things that you've liked, things that you've used, and not trying to do the analysis for it, but saying, here AI, here are all of the things that I've liked. Now you analyze the similarities and differences between these things and come up with a framework for yourself. And then use that framework and apply it to what I want now.
Definitely. So making sure that you're very clear on what assumptions you make and communicating that to and giving those examples.
Yeah, I'd say giving good examples, but also understanding that your definitions might not match another system's definitions.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Schuyler, for coming on the pod and for sharing all of your insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you want the full breakdown, it's on techprofounder.com.